Hi everyone, welcome to round 4 of ICU Tournament 2024. My name is Bea, I'm going to be your chair for today. I do have one panelist with me. I'll allow them to introduce themselves. Go ahead. Okay, lovely. Just a couple of reminders. First, please do keep a timer with you on all times. And second of all, in light of the transition from online to on-site debating, I am not legally enforced to follow your POI preferences. So speakers, for example, even if you do have a preference to, let's say, take POIs non-verbally or take POIs at the 5th minute, members of the opposing side of the bench can choose to respect that personally, but it's not something that I, as a panel, can legally enforce other people to follow. So if that's clear, I just want to clarify what's the veto on Gov?
I think we both vetoes again. Yeah, we both
is it a perfect veto?
Yes, yeah, because we both before this motion.
Okay. So what is the chosen motion?
First motion.
Here's the first motion. Give me a second. Sorry. This house prefers a world where people believe the afterlife to be through karmic reincarnation rather than heaven or hell.
Okay, thank you. Alright, debating on that motion, let's call PM.
3,000 years before Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill thought up utilitarianism, Siddhartha Gautama delivered an extremely advanced moral philosophy, one that is not based upon the whims and fancies of an all-arbitrary and all-inscrutable God, but rather the good you do in society, the benefit that you bring to people around you, whether you leave the world a better place than when you came in. And that's the philosophical system that proposition defends. Before I get to my argumentation, a couple of points of framing. The first thing to note is that this debate assumes some level of consciousness at the point at which you incarnate into whatever future life form you are. So people on both sides have a symmetrically strong belief that this is the case, that when they become a chicken, they will see the world as a chicken and be able to do moral duties as a chicken. In the same way, they will go to heaven and experience all the pain of hell and the hellfire and the joys of heaven. The second thing to note here is that given that this is a prefers a world debate, we have no idea what this looks like in this hypothetical world. Probably the closest approximations we have are religions which actually do believe this. So proposition, for example, stands for Taoism and Buddhism, both of which don't have a central God figure, but rather depend on a system of karma. While opposition defends, for example, religions like Islam and Christianity, where this is actually manifested in the real world. Your last point of framing I want to talk about is the purpose of religion. We think the primary purpose of religion is a guide to moral action rather than comfort. This is because in the majority of instances, religions have other ways by which they can provide comfort. For instance, they bring you to a communal space, they share anxieties about the real world and what life and existential questions are like. You can find alternative sources of comfort, etc. But religion primarily focuses as a guide to moral action, and we'll explain why that's more important later. So my argument is simple. I will prove to you why this is a better moral and this is a better way by religion is a better and less coercive way by which you can change your moral preferences in a couple of ways. The first is that there is a greater impetus to do good under this system. The simple argument here is that in their side of the house, the afterlife is binary. Religions are able to use the promise that you get into into heaven, etc. if you pass a certain threshold of doing good in the world. In some instances, the threshold is as low as I believe, and I say the words, and I automatically in heaven. The problem here then is that there's little impetus to actually do that much good after you believe you already got in. And the simple intuition part I want to point to you is the extent to which you try hard for a class in university if you know it's pass-fail, versus if you are graded upon an ABC system. On the outside of the house, you can always do more good. You can always get more karma. You can always get to a higher plane of existence. Given that humanity is a pretty high plane of existence, and you want to, and even within humanity, there's people with different levels of fortune within humanity. You want to be able to get the higher karma in the future. What this implies then is that everything matters. Whenever you walk by a beggar on the street and outside of the house, you always see an opportunity to get more karma. Versus on their side, when individuals go, well, I've already given enough, I've already done enough, or I already am a believer, therefore I no longer have to do all of these beneficial things for society on our side. This therefore means that on our side, you have the constant impetus to do good, constant impetus to give to charity, constant impetus to help the poor and vulnerable, constant impetus to be nice to your parents and to people around you. These are good things that we want people to do because they generally make life a less shitty time and a road a less shitty place. All of these are massive benefits we get on our side of the house. But the second and even more important thing is that there is a lack of a central authority. The premise here is that a karmic system, it depends upon the good or the bad you bring into the world. It's based on your dharma and karma. The problem with heaven and hell is that there's a fellow who decides whether you get in. In Christianity, it's Saint Peter. In Islam, it is Malaikat Gabriel. All of this therefore means that whether you get to heaven or hell and reside with God and His decision of where you get into is very simply that these are inscrutable moral metrics. You can see how much good or harm you do in the world, but you cannot scrutinize what God wants because His will and His desires are not accessible to you. Why is this problematic? At worst, this means that it can often be manipulated by religious authorities to consolidate power for themselves and dominant social groups. This looks like, for example, straight people using this to monopolize social power as compared to individuals who are deviant as compared to their religion. This looks like men who are able to consolidate patriarchal authority under the guise of religious systems in Islam and Christianity both. All of this means then that your ability to get people to behave in ways that are harmful to other people is heightened the point in which you are able to claim that it's because of the will of God. You can't do that with a karmic system. Buddhism is remarkably progressive for the very simple reason that if you are homophobe to someone, that's dharma because you clearly shut on their personality. All of these are better ways by which we can ensure social progress, better ways by which we are able to actually allow for better moral codes to manifest on our side of the house. But even if you don't believe that, at minimum, this means that you're always unsure. So we're not talking about the super religious people, we're talking about the people who sort of live regular ambiguous lives. You're never sure what God wants for you, whether this is the correct moral discipline for you. This means the extent to which you can get comfort in your future and afterlife, and whether you're making God happy is abstract. But if you do good for society, you give money to a beggar, obviously you're making the fella's life better. You're obviously getting more karma. He has somewhere to sleep tonight. He has something to eat tonight. These are benefits you can immediately see in religious experiences and religious comfort you can immediately get. Sure.
If people don't know what's good and bad, why is it likely to manifest in the ways that you want it to be?
So, as I mentioned before, if people don't know what happens when you go to heaven or what decides how you go into heaven, they default to religious authority. The religious authority tends to want to consolidate power to itself and its religious teachings. Unfortunately, these are fairly arbitrary and based on the social yardsticks of the time. These tended to be during fairly regressive times, such as in the past. That's why. So, what all of this argumentation proves to you, therefore, is on our side of the house, we bring more comfort to minorities who are excluded from religious systems in the status quo. We bring more impetus to help the poor and help the vulnerable on our side. We're winning all of these yardsticks. But I'm going to bring a second argument here on why religion as a whole is less coercive as an institution. Why? The problem with heaven and hell is that number one, it is eternal. You go to hell, you're there forever, you keep burning and having your skin peeled off by demons forever. If you reincarnate into a chicken, you will not be a chicken for long. What this means, therefore, is that the extent to which religion is able to fearmonger and terrify you into believing its teachings, because the chicken dies, you get into, a goat, and from goat you become human again. All of these are ways by which religion can manipulate and fearmonger its people that do not exist on our side of the house because these things are fundamentally temporary. But beyond that, you know what it's like to be a chicken. It's not that bad. You know what it's like to be a goat. It's not that bad. You don't know what it's like to be in hell. And the infinite horrors that await you mean that religious leaders are able to capitalize on that fear and constantly coerce you into their teachings, even when you know it's wrong. The counterfactual on our side is that people do things that are moral based on what they see is moral. They see that helping someone poor is a moral thing to do, and they are able to rationalize it because human beings have an innate desire to be good. We allow them to exploit the desire on our side. Opposition traps people in moral systems determined by religions that are fundamentally coercive, that are fundamentally arbitrary, that are fundamentally outdated, and that's why they've lost this debate from my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, PM. Hello.
Couple of things in my speech. First, a couple of rebuttals on what Prime Minister had to say. Second, clarifying the stakeholders and who the most important stakeholder to religion is. And third, a comparison of which model incentivizes people to do moral activities and good behavior better. Couple of rebuttals. Prime Minister comes up and tells you that because there's a binary system in heaven and hell, good and bad, it's going to be bad because people fill a certain quota of karma, and then after that they just go, okay, I'm done. I don't think religion works as simple as that because there's no metric of how much karma you need to fill or how much good deeds you need to do in order to get to heaven. And there's no defined mechanism. I think people will still be incentivized to keep doing good things so that they can ensure their spot in heaven. Second, I think their mechanism only works, there are smaller units of karma, therefore you're incentivized to do things. Only works in a model where this karma works like you do good thing today and then you get good results later. I think this is not the crux of the debate. We're talking about lifelong experiences. So the incentive to do good kind of is parallel on both sides because it's such a long-term activity. Second, they say that unipolar moral values based on God is bad because, but I think that there's no clear metric of what is good and what is bad for like getting good karma isn't clear on government either, and it's worse for the disenfranchised because the only clear thing that you can see in karma is the results, and you're blamed for the bad results that you have right now, you're born into, is worse for the disenfranchised individuals that they're so worried about. Third, about the chicken, you're not going to stay a chicken for long. This is exactly against their case because now you have less incentive, because you're not going to be punished for that long, you have less incentive to actually do good. So, who are the most important stakeholders in today's debate? I think it's largely everyone, but most importantly, disenfranchised. Firstly, for everyone, I think having a better life in the future and incentivizing people to do good based on that promise is not that strong of an incentive to do good. Why? Because life is in itself is very tiring. If you live like 80, 90 years, you hear old people who have lived that long and say, oh, it's my time to go. My life has been very, very tiring. I don't think the prospect of a new life from the beginning to being born as a rich person or as a kid is not that enticing of an opportunity. Through life, and also because you have tangible things that you have to look up to and think that you are good, I think this has a couple of problems. Through life, you build your own metrics of happiness and the satisfaction, right? So sometimes people are satisfied with the life they live, but the narrative is most likely going to be, you're going to be born as a better person, as another person, as a king, let's say. What happens is, because you have your own metrics of happiness, if someone promises to me, oh, you're going to be born as a king or as a rich person, I've already built my own metrics of happiness, and that doesn't feel really rewarding or good or enticing, doesn't act as that much of an incentive. So the line that so if you've lived a moderately happy life, then being born as another person, the incentive isn't that clear because I've been very tired through my life and I lived a happy one. Why should I look forward to the next one? I think this is very unclear. And also, on the other hand, the idea of eternal heaven and hell is very much internalized. Why is this important? Because you don't look at another life and say, oh, is this enticing or not? Because heaven is an absolutely good thing and hell is an absolutely bad thing. What's going to happen is that you internalize these images of heaven and hell. Heaven is absolutely going to be the best thing that I can imagine. Hell is going to be absolutely the worst thing I'm going to imagine. It's not going to be the person next to me. It's not going to be the person that's in higher echelons of society that may be going through their own pain. It's absolutely going to be good subjectively, bad subjectively in my own metric. That's why it's a better incentive system. But who are the people who actually need religion the most? I'd say it's I think that.
Do you have epistemic access of what hell actually is and what it actually looks like?
We don't. That's why we internalize it. That's why it's a stronger mechanism. So, who actually needs religion the most? I would say it's the poor and middle class. Because rich people have good lives anyways. But poor and middle class people are faced with situations of bad circumstances and bad moral luck. And they need the most motivation and solace from these religions to say, you are in this bad circumstance, you are poor, but you should not steal, you should not murder other people, you should not opt into bad behavior. That's the function of religion, that's the most important function that religion serves. In this function, the problem with reincarnation is that it pushes aspects of complete moral luck onto poor people, saying that you are the problem. These randomized transits, being born into a bad family, being born into this terrible situation is your fault. You are being punished for your sin. There is less incentive, but if you look at it societally, that's in itself of a bad thing for the individual. But when you look at it societally, there's less incentive for things like social welfare and social safety nets and efforts to help the poor if they're so worried about the disenfranchised. Because now it's a God-given or a karma-driven system where you're being punished for things that you've done in the afterlife. So the fact that you're poor isn't an unfortunate reality, it's just that you're getting what you deserve, so no one wants to help you in society. It justifies, but even worse, it doesn't just stigmatize poor people for being poor, it justifies the unfair systems of power and inequality that exist within our society. The rich are rich not because they're unjustly exploiting these individuals, they're rich because they're being rewarded for good things that they did in the past. So I deserve to exploit these individuals, I deserve to live in the system, I deserve to be a beneficiary of this. What is the delta here? The delta is that the good of heaven and hell on our world will give you a stronger idea that you will be rewarded, as I mentioned before, for a good deed that you did, even in these hard circumstances. But more importantly, inequality is not your fault. And even more importantly, it gives a unique mechanism on our world that doesn't exist on theirs. It is that your exploiters and the people who are taking advantage of you and the people who made these systems of inequality will now be punished for the bad things that they do, and they will be sent to hell, and they will be blamed for these ideas. And it's not that they're being righteously being rewarded for the things that they did in the past life. I think that is what leads to the sense of justice and the sense that I have to do something right for these poor people. And these people need them the most because they are in the worst circumstances. Only after this sense of justice is instilled in these disenfranchised people is the incentive to do good actually possible. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, Alo. BPM.
The strongest claim from their side is that poor people will be seen as punished for the sins of their past life. The first response is that this is at best symmetric. On their side, these same poor people will be seen as people eventually going to be sent to hell, and that justifies their mistreatment. But more directly, this premise assumes that people believe in the continuity across lifetimes and that you inherit sins from previous people. It is unclear that people think the sins of your past life transferred and tarnished your soul. Therefore, they'll see the new person who is poor as a distinct entity and not someone that ought to be punished. But also, just very trivially, if you are born a human, even if you are born a poor human, being a human is a good coming outcome, so they will likely to believe that you were good in your previous life. If you were bad in your previous life, you'll be born something like a rat or a cockroach. This argument is dislodged from the debate. The first question I want to ask is, what is the importance of belief? Ian explains that it is a source of moral guidance and provides an incentive to do good and be more empathetic and to resist the human urge to be selfish. Heaven and hell are absolute categories. You either end up in heaven or you end up in hell. Most religions tell their followers that if you are faithful, if you change and convert to our religion, your sins will be forgiven and you will go to heaven. So this response from them, that people don't know whether they will go to heaven or hell, does not apply to the upper middle class white individuals who have been told by their pastors from a young age that because of the fact that they are Christian, by the pure virtue of the fact that you worship God, you will be going to heaven. This is incredibly prominent in the grace gospel that is preached in many Christian evangelist church, where the pastors constantly tell them that no matter what sins you commit, you'll be forgiven and you'll immediately go to heaven because heaven is for all of the people that worship Jesus. So many people do know and are assured that they will go to heaven. And this activates all of the arguments that Ian tells you, which is that the force for you to continue doing good is gone at the point in which you have already feel assured that you've got secured a lot in the afterlife. And the reason why this premise is true, that the churches will tell people that you are going to secure your spot in heaven as long as you worship Jesus, is because it's a very attractive narrative for churches to sell. It is really appealing to tell people that all of your sins will be forgiven and you'll be redeemed, and that activates the comfort argument that they wanted on their side of the house. But the problem is, they never weighed out why comfort on their side was mutually exclusive. Ian already told you that in life, there are a plethora of other ways in the physical world that we can also get comfort. But more importantly, even within the system of karmic reincarnation, we can also get comfort. Comfort that our next life will be better. We are able to enjoy more experiences and meet nice people. Comfort that we'll be reunited with our loved ones, where we'll be both reincarnated as chickens and then we'll sunbathe together as chickens. are those not also equal sources of comfort? So in order for them to get their singular benefit of comfort, which only applies to the people that meet the standards of going to heaven, they have to forsake all of the moral guidance arguments that Ian already told you was supremely important. The conclusion here is simple. Millions of upper middle class white people think they already have met the threshold of going to heaven and stop doing good. The vast majority of people, religious people, do good because they want to achieve a good life after they die. This is the primal motivation that speaks to our existential fear of what happens when we die. It speaks to the existential question about what happens and what is there after this mortal plane. It's the prime thing that motivates people to do more good and affects our daily decisions. This is a stronger force that mobilizes people. With a karmic system in the comparative, there is a gradient of possible outcomes. The incentive for people to maximize their chances to have the best possible afterlife imaginable. This means religion as a guiding force is more consistently applied through life. It is not just that you convert to be a Christian when you are 18 and then for the rest of your life you have heaven secured for you. It is a daily routine where every day is an exercise of kindness and a challenge to be a good person. People doing more volunteering, people donating to charity, helping the homeless and sick. And their question here was, how do people know what is good or bad? And the answer Ian gives is correct. They won't, and that's why they will default to actions that are clearly and universally moral. In the ambiguity of not knowing what is good or bad, you will default to things that are primal to your moral intuitions, like helping people, making other people happy, and being kind. This is a huge generator of social good for the most vulnerable individual. The response that they had here was the afterlife is not enticing. This is a weak response that doesn't pass the intuition check. Like being told that I'll be born into a life where I live in a mansion that can travel the world is immensely appealing, rather than spending an eternity in heaven where the streets are gold. That doesn't sound very appealing to me. The point is, heaven is too abstract to be appealing, but telling people concrete things that they can conceptualize, that you can travel the world, that you can eat good food, those are things that are infinitely more enticing. But it's not just grander gestures of charity and volunteering that we achieve that generate huge amounts of social good. It's also that we get better daily acts of kindness. If you know that there's an invisible karma bank balance that is constantly being added and subtracted throughout your life, this is when every action has the potential to add or minus total karma. For absolute categories like heaven or hell, believers will think me littering in the lecture theatre in Japan will not get me to hell. Me not flushing the toilet won't get me to hell. The problem is that absolute categories require similarly proportionally absolute actions. And the point is, most actions are not absolute. If you live your lifetime, 20 years of your lifetime, you're probably not doing things that are immensely moral or immensely immoral. And the problem is, for your daily actions, most of those things won't count to your lot in the afterlife. But under a karma system, even if it adds just one good karma, that is again a 1% chance that you are increasing of being able to be born into a better life. So every action is a lot more intentional and people are a lot more conscious. But it's not just that it was kinder actions, it was also more accessible. Under a system where it's absolute categories, you have to do proportionately grand gestures like donating huge sums of money, because only then doing huge things to get you into heaven. On outside, everybody can be kind to someone else. Everyone can be kind to their neighbors. This is a system that's more accessible. Yes, PY.
Even in Christianity, believing in Jesus isn't the only prerequisite. It includes acting upon his teachings, doing good deeds as well as you can, still incentivizing people to do better.
Well, the point is, even if it says doing good is important, the Bible says if you are a Christian, you will go to heaven. So even Christians who do bad things will go to heaven. And that's the reason why there is no added incentive on top of that. And also, if you want to access your arguments about comfort, you have to admit that it's really easy for all of these people to get into heaven. So, notably, for absolute categories like heaven or hell, it requires proportionally absolute action. The point is that karma is a natural system. There's no central authority, which means that people default to universal moral principles that can be clearly identified as good or bad. The impact of this argument is important because there are millions of people, criminals and addicts, who feel like the stain of their sins can never be washed off and wait to die and rot in hell. For the LGBTQ people that live across the world, they have been told by their pastors that because of the virtue of the fact that they are gay, they'll fundamentally never be allowed past the gates into heaven. For all of these people, heaven and hell are domains controlled by people with divine authority that can impose God's intentions onto heaven and hell. Because heaven and hell are unknowable, because God is unknowable, these divine authorities, they are often misogynistic or sexist, get to decide the standards for who goes into heaven or hell. But karma is a system that exists in the natural world and is an abstract force, which means that for all of the LGBTQ people, maybe they'll never be able to completely change their bank balance, but at least they can get a slightly better life and be a slightly nicer chicken.
THBT dialogue.
first thing I just want to tackle is why we think the perception of what's good and bad is also likely to be quite good on our side of the house. The first reason for this is usually religion is established after a point in time where a sense of morality has been established. So I don't think that just because you're not religious, you have no sense of morality. I think that largely speaking, a lot of sense of morality and what moral metrics are usually created independent of religions. At the point in time in which religions are created, for example, you want a lot of people to buy into it, which is why a lot of these are likely to be congruent with what people generally believe in as well. But the second thing is you look at a lot of religious interpretations, even within central authorities, always changing in time, largely because a lot of religions have an incentive to make sure that their follower base stays with them, for example, or make sure that they bring in more followers, which oftentimes means that a lot of these are also very reflective of things like social norms, and therefore also likely to change. And I would also point out that the government is very assertive here, because they themselves come up and say, on their side, the conception of what's good and bad is likely to be donations, but on our side, it is likely to be random things like trade. And it's unclear to me why it also has to be something that's comparative on their side. But the second thing I would call out is that even things like Buddhism, all sorts of religion that is established regardless of whether or not you have central authority, does have some sort of written text, which means that on their side, presumably, if the premise of their argument is that a lot of these moral values are flawed from the way, the time being in which they were written, a lot of the doctrines from the time in which they were written were also written at a point in time which is true, which is why at best their argument about why what's good and bad is likely to be worse on our side is symmetric. But the second thing that Yuhyeok explains to you is why a lot of the conception of what's good and bad is also likely to be worse on their side. And this is where the analysis from the PM comes in, because the PM comes in and says, oh well, people on their side won't know what's actually good and bad because it's likely to be vague. I think what that means is that it's more up to interpretation of individuals to see what they believe to be good and bad in terms of the grand scheme of things. I think this interpretation is likely to happen in a couple of bad ways. The first reason is obvious because I think that people generally, if it's true that people are generally selfish, I also do think that people generally have an incentive to subscribe to the more convenient metrics of what's good and bad. So obviously I think it's more likely that they're going to subscribe to convenient things, like just praying if that's ambiguous on their side of the house, because there's no one to tell them what is actually good and bad. But the second thing we explained to you is that there's a lot of stigmatization against poor people that happens on their side for the large reason, because on their side, presumably, a majority of people believe in karmic reincarnation to be a corrective mechanism, which means that a lot of them believe, for example, that it is a very important thing that these people are being punished for the bad things they have done in the past, so forth and so forth. Which means that I think there's just generally less less impetus for people to do things like donation as their go-to method of good things in the first place. But the second part is that independently of this, I just think that poor people just generally feel very bad. Insofar as they also have to internalize things like, oh, I deserve this life because I have done some bad things in the past, for example, and therefore I deserve this punishment to a certain extent. So sure, maybe my soul can be cleansed, but people just generally internalize that the suffering that they're going through now is something that is just, something that they should be going through, and therefore I think it just means that like overall it's really bad for poor people as well. But the second thing is, I would say there's also a flip to this. If their main insight, or if their main suggestion here is to suggest that on their side, you get like better enforcement standards because you continue to have to do good things to get like to the highest top ladder. I just think that this is also not like the strongest incentive to begin with, largely because I feel like people generally over time realize that material wealth or things like that is not the most overall like the all end be all standard. Insofar as a lot of people over time do learn that, for example, you gain a lot of meaning to things like human relationships and the sort, which is why I don't think that the incentive for people is to do like as many good things as you can and therefore go up to the top of the ladder. I think that people genuinely would also be quite content with getting like a mediocre or a normal human life on their side as well. It's unclear what the metric is like to go as far as you want. But before I move on, POI.
The point is that you can't see your karmic bank balance, so you don't know whether you've achieved a mediocre life yet. So that's the incentive to make sure you keep doing good to ensure at least you get a mediocre life.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is also on our side, you don't know whether or not you've reached the threshold. But the second thing we explain is that I think the premise of that is that you need to explain why those good things are actually good things that you want. Because your main win condition here is to suggest that people on net are doing self-corrective things. But it's unclear if people are super selfish, but on your side, there's no one to tell them what is actually good and bad. Why do we think people are actually going to buy into things that are actively, actually good? And things like donations, I think they're more likely buying things that are relatively more convenient to do. So if their suggestion here is to say that people on our side will just randomly pray, I think that's probably more likely on their side, insofar as these are more convenient things to do. Next thing I want to talk about is why we think, at worst, it's presumably better. But let's say we concede to all of these things. So let's say in the worst case, you get less corrective mechanism. You say, for example, and let's say like the way in which people get into heaven and hell is very low threshold, and then let's assume that you get into heaven and hell by praying. I would say worst case, what's wrong with that? I think that this is obviously just the most accessible way of solace for a lot of people as well. Insofar as, for example, if their suggestion here is to say that like the way in which you get into heaven and hell is by donating a lot, I think that just means that like a lot of poor people are damned for a long period of time. So although it's not permanent, for example, it just takes like a very long period of time to get there, for example, there's not much they can do to alleviate the suffering that they have within their, like short-term life, for example. I think comparatively speaking, on our side, if it is true that all of your assumptions are true, I think at best what it means for poor people is that for poor people, for a lot of these people are suffering and are feeling like they're damned for eternity. For these people, they at least know that there's a very accessible way for them to get into heaven, to get some level of solace. Because if the suggestion is true, I think for a lot of poor people, and for people who do not have the ability to do things like donation, for a lot of people, this is probably the most accessible form of solace. The reason why this is important is quite intuitive. Obviously, these people are living a really shitty life. Obviously, these people are very, very unhappy, and they have a lot of stuff, a lot of hope, and a lot of like societal systems. I think for these people, this is probably the only way in which they can be assured that at one point you're going to be guaranteed some level of solace. But the second thing is, I think it just also applies for a lot of people as well. I just think that it's very tiring to have to continuously have to calculate, like, how much good things I've done in a world in which you don't even know whether or not you're doing actually the good things or not. So in their worst case, even if people don't do actively bad things, I just think that it means for people it's very, very confusing. That it's just, you continuously have to live in the fear of like, you don't know how much you've done, for example. I think that just means that people are just very, very uncomfortable to begin with. I think that people just live very, very tiring lives in which they always have to calculate every single move they do, as opposed to doing things that they want to do. And I think that is also a world in which you become more oppressive. Insofar as we explained to you why a lot of their doctrines are also likely conservative, if ours is also conservative, I think those are instances in which people begin, it's easier for religions to also police individual actions of individual people. I think that in a world in which a lot of things are more accessible for people, for example, is a world in which A, uniquely allow people to become more comfortable in their lives, to access more amounts of solace, and therefore find more hope in their lives. But the second thing is, I think we just also explain why we get reasonable levels of self-correction on our side, and why, most importantly, that level of self-correction is likely to trigger in good ways, because we actually give them what are things that are good, as opposed to explaining, vaguely that you should do good things, but not explaining to people what those good things are. Because of all these reasons, opposition.
Alright, thank you. Go good.
There is a tier list of reincarnation, meaning to say if you are tier 1, maybe you'll be a rich human being. Maybe tier 2, you are a poor human being. Tier 3, chicken, tier 4, cow, whatsoever. But the point is, as a human being, you are generally judged to be someone who has done good in their lives, because you have ultimate consciousness, ultimate agency over this particular life, and it's an ultimate human life form as well. They cannot claim at once that it is accessible and at the same time suggest that people will do infinite good. Because if it is so easy to get salvation, if it is so easy to get divine judgment, then it is untrue that people will try really hard. Think of the pass-fail modules that you always have. Is it likely that you will to a large degree study very hard for the pass-fail module? We don't think so. And we think they are contradictory in the claims and the premises of those claims to begin with. That is why many Taoist and Buddhist churches, Buddhist temples, do have devotees who take lifelong actions to devote themselves to doing good things for their community, and doing good things for the temples to begin with. Is it tiring? Yes, it is tiring. But it is the thing that you need to do and enforce in order for your life to be dedicated to something that's good, to be dedicated for the salvation that you want to begin with. We don't think you can simultaneously say it is tiring, but at the same time suggest that that is something that will bring you to heaven to begin with. I'm going to talk about two things. The first is who behaves better, and secondly about some level of minorities that we think is a little bit less important. The first is who behaves better, because we make the observation that observers of karma and dharma are likely to look at salvation as in more granular details, i.e. helping other people, volunteer in soup kitchens, amongst other things, to a larger degree than compared to what the Christianity family does to begin with. There are a few reasons why. The first is that there's an accumulative element, i.e. the credit that focuses on individual actions and actions that you can do as opposed to actions that you cannot do in this particular life. That means if you're a poor person, you can still do good actions such as helping your fellow poor person on the street or like helping set up a homeless community amongst the homeless to begin with. That is something that you can do to accumulate good credit to begin with. Their side doesn't have this actually, and the mechanism to do good action doesn't exist on their side. What this means is that you reduce the focus on grand gestures because an arbitrary marker to what gets you to heaven and what gets you to the eternal reward that you want is actually significantly higher. So the priority for grander gestures is much higher than the granular details that you get. So under our side, on a day-to-day basis, we will think of the day-to-day things we can help other people. Greeting someone or saying hi to someone or like having a chat with someone to make their day better is also a good positive karma that helps you to increase that particular element. But secondly, also, there's an equivalent exchange that's important here. In giving, you will receive. And therefore, as a result, this is something that this is a kind of practice that you will therefore receive in the first place. We ask a simple POI here. Do we have access to what hell is? And the reason we ask this question is that it informs whether people will change their behavior on their side. The problem here is that they say that there is no access to this particular version. That's why it's problematic for two reasons. The first is that if we don't have knowledge, this supercharges Ian's argument that we empathize more proximate with the animalistic kind of experiences such as the animals or chickens and like cows, for example, than compared to the idea of eternal heaven and hell, because we don't have access to these things. As a result of this, what happens is you will likely discount that kind of behavior. So many of the times, like gangsters or hoodlums or like those people who are minorities believe that there's no chance for them to go to heaven, and therefore they are co-opting the experience of hell altogether without actually thinking about whether or not that allows them some level of redemption to begin with. So under their side, there's a higher propensity for them to co-opt hell as a harm because they cannot imagine what actually it looks like and they cannot imagine what harms they are going to get out of it. But on our side, at the very least, we at least allow karmic balance to be like, if I had lived maybe 10, 20 years of being a gangster or being a hoodlum or killing people or shooting people, for example, there is some level of salvation that I can do. Maybe slowly and granularly we can work towards something that's good to begin with. We think that provides comfort, and we think that provides the kinds of changes that we think is important to our day-to-day lives. Because if we think about this particular idea of like you qualifying for heaven, right? We think that people are likely to give up because they believe that the cumulative debt of what they have already done will not get them anywhere else in the future. And therefore, if they are benefiting in any aspect, you are likely to benefit from people who are like rich and white and like people who already have that positive credit to begin with, as compared to ours, and we think that's bad. Cavan tells you that it's easy for churches to sell the narrative that Christianity guarantees your entrance to the gates of heaven, that people believe in salvation. The problem is that it is a centralizing and exclusive thing that churches rely on. So for example, if the benefit accrues, they're likely to concentrate on the churches and the Christian people to begin with. So this particular benefit of doing good on their side concentrates around Christianity. We think that's different for like people who are believers of Buddhism or Taoism, for example, where we help generally the community at large. And we think that particularly is important because it's important for us to think about doing good for the society rather than doing good for your religion specifically. And we think that's important. But because we don't know what divine judgment is, because we don't know what exactly the things are, we think it is much worse than their criticism of our argument. Their criticism is that we don't know what the karmic bank balance is. But the karmic bank balance is not something that's on your like bank account, right? It's something that you internalize to begin with. If I personally felt that I've done something bad, I can think about that particular judgment and think about what I can do to reverse that particular this credit to begin with. And that's something that we think is important. As opposed to the divine judgment where you have absolutely no idea what God judges to be good, what God judges to be bad. We think what this deprioritizes is the poor people who do not believe that any gestures that they do will bring them to heaven. As a result, we think this is a much worse calculus for individuals to do any good deed, and we think that's something that's bad. But the last thing is that they suggest that if you are a poor person, it is likely that you'll feel bad about yourself because you believe in your past life that there's something that you've done that leads you to this particular place. We've explained in preamble why that's not true, but secondly and more importantly, many people around the world, religious or not, believe in tabula rasa, like you live in a blank slate here, and therefore you are likely to believe that this particular life that you're leading is the determinant of whether or not you get to the next particular lifetime to begin with, right? As a result, we think this is not the criticism that we think lends the debate. We are very proud of it.
Thank you. Alpin.
We'll start in 3, 2, 1. The major clarification that we have in this debate is that people are not perfect and cannot be expected to do good all the time. Some people just generally don't care. More importantly, people don't know the appropriate action to offset bad daily actions in government side, nor do they know that they've done something bad already. It's something that they cannot measure tangibly in how enforcing the mechanism is actually being engulfed. Second is that only in their best case works if they can really count how many people really count the amount of good that they do in their lives, or how strong is that really going to be enforced in society to the extent that the vast majority of people are likely to be conscious, even in the argument of ambiguity and abstraction. I'm not entirely sure why that is a convincing mechanism to which more and more people are inclined to do more good in this debate. Two issues in this debate. Two issues. One is that how do we measure, push, and incentive individuals to do more good, and why this tips to offside? And second, why do we provide greater degrees of solace, as proven by my previous speakers? The first issue, we have to characterize what karmic reincarnation essentially does systemically. Because number one, they say abstraction, meaning that teachings are not explicit, only the guidance of do good, no harm, don't disturb your neighbor's peace is something that is the most tangible thing that we can evidence from God. While there's good intentions towards many individuals, it opens up moral ambiguity to which good actions are not relevant to a person's moral compass. It could be different from one person to another, and they might not be even aligned to the karmic laws. Second, at best, they stay neutral when they're super or hyper aware because they're afraid accidental violations on the karmic law might happen. Maybe everything or everyone understands karmic reincarnation, but society does not frown upon the same evil acts done in many scenarios as it would have been towards heaven and hell scenarios when there's very clear instructions of don't kill, don't rape, don't murder, etc. Our comparative, thirdly, actually shows moral codes more explicitly, and this is why the doctrines are likely to be good in opposition side. You don't kill, you don't cheat. The conceptualization of fear and punishment psychologically pushes individuals to do more good. I probably don't know actual hell is. Probably I live a hellish life subjectively. I understand there are terrible events. But hell is likely to be 1,000-fold worse. Therefore, I'd like to be more careful in opposition side. Care for my parents, neighbors, donate to charities, even repent from my sins because I am afraid of eternal damnation. That is something very, very clear from opposition side, because suffering 1,000-fold is much, much clearer, even if, let's say, in karmic reincarnation you become a toad. That might not be essentially bad for some people at all. Second, the lack of a central authority is even worse for government side, because the intuition here is that every individual is imperfect. You need someone to police or guard you, especially you need someone to watch over you. A symbol of paradise in a lot of media narratives today that convict you makes you more receptive as a collective constant reminders that you have every day in each of your life. Right? Not only is our side clear to follow on what the individual should do, but also provide external mechanisms and pressure to keep yourselves in check. Reality is that not every individual is 100% mindful, but at least on our side of the house, we can claim a cultural phenomenon of repentance, a cultural phenomenon by which you have to make sure that you attend church, you have to follow the teachings of the Ten Commandments. It's much more assured and connects you even further towards spirituality, whereas I don't necessarily understand why a lot of people will be inherently good in government side to begin with. Meaning, this eventually implicates that a lot of individuals who are probably having questions about their lives reach more satisfaction and reach more, at least, guidance towards how can I be a better individual and be more intentional about it and having more ability to access the good that I want to have in my life. But second, these self-checks are likely to be more guaranteed primarily because not only you are watching over yourself, but you can also watch over your neighbors in the same belief systems, but also you have other infrastructures or other institutions to keep you in check. You have pastors, you have leaders, whatever religious denomination will necessarily tell you what should be a proper spiritual guidance should be. Therefore, in measuring the incentives and the push for individuals to do good, the abstraction actually falls on government side because this is their downfall when they do not necessarily understand the tangible ways to offset immoral actions because it's not clear, or probably doing good actions is also not clear today, especially in government side. Therefore, if you are likely to be an individual who is in seek of good intentions, or who is in seek of good points or heaven points or whatever, it's likelier that you can claim these benefits in the government side, opposition side, because again, conceptualization and push for being fearful for our lives in the next is something that is more achievable. But the second clash here is that why do we provide greater degrees of solace? And this is very, very important in this debate, right? A lot of people in the world are very tired, suffering already throughout decades and decades after multiple oppressions, as LO and DLO does suggest, right? Meaning that you have to navigate your life through the chaos over and over again, and this is simply difficult, right? Think about how I have to be a chicken and eating only worms and not cannibal my children and not cannibal other chickens as well. But you only have a brain of a chicken in your afterlife. How would you know better outside your animal instincts? Even if it's better, I think maybe you're likely to be a monkey. But that there's going to be a new value system that you have to adhere to and something that you have to study again. People prefer a finality after the average lifespan already of 60 to 70 years because they have seen enough. They don't want to be tirelessly waiting of what paradise could be, or probably the paradise that they have is currently the paradise or the current life form that they have right now that they're not necessarily aware of, meaning whatever good, whatever bad that they do right now is something that's meaningless because they, again, do not know to what extent it can manifest in the future. Go on.
Religious elites have the ability and incentive to base membership of heaven of membership of their own organizations and conformity with their beliefs. This lowers the bar and excludes swathes of minorities. On our side, karma is based on visceral good you do to others.
But even if they're minorities, even if people are subscribing to religion, but even if they're not subscribing to religion, it's not certain that these people would necessarily know good points or how they can necessarily get better lives in the future. I don't think that matters in the debate, but rather on your side of the house, you have uncertainty because this actually means that you have more life resources wasted in your life for the uncertainty that you can necessarily have better or worse lives in the future. Right. So secondly, is that if you're a poor individual, less fortunate, you have less capacity to, let's say, upgrade your lifestyle because you cannot donate, you cannot necessarily volunteer towards soup kitchens even if you're poor. You try to live an honest life, but even if you think this is the best capacity that you can, it's probably not as meaningful, and I'd be nihilist more and more each day and not necessarily take care of these things. For all these reasons, I think what we better achieve in this debate is that our accessibility to solace is much higher to minorities and vulnerable individuals. But second, the idea of justice and punishment is just much more clear that pushes individuals to do more good and access more solace in opposition side.
Thank you. I'll reply. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The first question I will ask is on epistemic axis. The second question I'll ask is just on which side do people live better lives. The first question is on epistemic axis. The first thing I will just point out here is that the government actually never also explains why people can imagine what the life of a chicken is reasonably. I think that's an unproven premise that they don't even prove. The second thing is, I think that people, on both sides, you have to reasonably imagine that people, to a certain extent, internalize these things. And then people on our side, the set from PM was that people on our side, most people on our side believe in things like heaven and hell. People constantly gaslight each other to believe in what heaven and hell looks like. I think both our first speaker and Whip also explains to you that people generally believe in heaven and hell to be things that like are generally good to them, things like comfort, so on and so forth, which means that I think debate only functions in a world in which you generally believe that people also believe that things like heaven and hell do exist to a certain extent. People generally do understand that heaven is good and hell is bad. But the second and most important question then to ask is on which side do people live on better lives? And I would say that there are two contradictions that come from their side. Because the first thing is, and before that though, there's an unproven premise as to why then people are likely to prioritize good things. Because the only explanation as we get from them is Yuhyeok saying that, oh, but then it's cumulative. But it's still unclear as to why you do cumulatively good things. We explain to you why people, if it is true that their premise, that people are generally selfish and don't want to give up, for example, their material wealth, it is quite likely that they go for the low-hanging fruit insofar as you don't actually give them what is actually good and bad. So sure, you can also pray on their side. Pray can be also cumulative. It's unclear as to why people automatically go for the actually good things like donations, which is what their first asked speaker actually wanted to characterize as their benefit. But the second thing is, it's also very unclear as to their responses to us is also very unclear. Because at one point they say that a lot of the gestures from opposition has to be very granular. But then in the next breath, they also say that, oh, but then it's very easy to get into heaven. So it's unclear what the correct characterization is. I would say that if it is high and granular like what they said, it's probably a good thing because then it means you have like more donations, which is what they wanted to achieve. But if it's also like a low-hanging fruit, that's also not a bad thing. Insofar as it just means that more people can get solace on our side. I think the conclusion of this is quite simple. I think as their PM says, it's unclear or we don't know what good and bad on our side would look like to a certain extent. So let's say prefers version, we don't know what this world would actually look like. We can only guarantee, we can't guarantee what the conception is likely to look like. I think the most assured thing then is that at least on our side, you know for sure what it is that you need to do. On their side, you don't know what it is that you need to do. I think it means, in the worst case, on our side, people don't have to waste their time to try to find out constantly what is good and bad. It means that people don't have to measure every single action they do, to worry every night about being born as a worm, because you don't know if you've actually done enough good things not to be born as a worm. Or if you don't, because if you don't even know if you've done the actually good things. So maybe the things you've been doing may not necessarily be good, but you don't know that because they say that you want ambiguity on their side of the house. So in the worst case, I would say even if you don't know what good and bad is likely to look on our side, I think comparatively speaking, at least you know what is good and bad, and that just means that you have less worry in your life in general. I think the way in which you evaluate this is quite simple. I would say the margin of benefit that you get for their side is very unclear insofar as things like corrective measures can be achieved by other things anyway. The first thing is obviously our laws don't exist. The second thing is we already outlined from THBT that things like a sense of morality is something that intrinsically just exists for many people in society in general. If you look at the majority of religious people, they don't go around committing immoral things in the first place. So I would say at best the margin of benefit that they get for a bit more corrective measures for religion is unclear. But I would posit that religion's spiritual solace that you get on our side is much more exclusive insofar as these are non-material things. Because maybe you can talk to friends in a world, like if you're unhappy, for example. But a lot of these struggles that you go through life are things that are, for example, things that you cannot these are things that you cannot just alleviate by doing things that are material. Like there's a limit to how many times you can talk to your friend, for example. There's a limit to how much money you can spend to alleviate your suffering, for example. So I would say the margin of benefit for getting spiritual comfort on our side is the most exclusive benefit in the round, which is why we're winning this debate. Very proud.
Thank you. Cover flag.
The reality of an average person's life is that it's quite mundane and low stakes. We are not battling between whether we should murder someone or not. It's more like whether I should flush the toilet after I use it so that Yuhyeok doesn't have to sit in a stinky toilet. This debate is about the thousands of small, seemingly insignificant decisions that we make every day. The system of karma imbues every action we do with meaning, and all of them become opportunities to gain karma. Unless they were willing to defend sending people to hell for not flushing the toilet, they could never attempt to reach our outcome. And on our world, at the end of this debate, people are more intentional, they are kinder and more empathetic. The first question I want to ask is, are people incentivized to do good? They say churches tell their followers to do good. Sure, but they don't say do good so you can go to heaven. So they don't have the incentive that makes people resist the primal instinct to be selfish. Churches tell people the prerequisite to get into heaven is God. This is observationally true because look at the grace gospel in evangelist churches that tell people you should come and be a Christian because that's how you get saved and go to heaven. But this is also structurally true because redemption is an appealing way to evangelize followers. Their mixed response was to say people don't know whether they will go to heaven or hell and they are not sure whether they'll meet the threshold. Judge, this completely knifes their entire case because in the world where you're not sure whether you'll go to heaven or hell, it's a world where you never get solace. So when they say people are tired and anxious of calculating karma, in a world where they don't know whether they go to heaven, they are tired and anxious about whether they go to heaven or hell and receive eternal damnation. So all of the harms of anxiety are worse on their side if people don't know whether they'll go to heaven or hell. If people do know they'll go to heaven or hell, everything in our case remains true. But next, they said that there are two responses that they had. They said the first is that the life of a rich person is not enticing, and the second is that people will just do enough good so they don't get reincarnated to be a chicken. Both of these are intuitively untrue. Being rich sounds amazing. People want to maximize their chances of a best life possible. But it's also structurally untrue. People don't know where their balance is at. They're not sure whether they've gained enough points to become a human or not. So there is a constant incentive that is consistently renewed to always do good. Then they said people do not know what is good or bad. But this is also the team that said moral metrics exist independently and exist intrinsically. If it's true that moral metrics exist intrinsically to everybody, then those same moral metrics that they claim exist intrinsically will also exist in our world, and those are the metrics that people will follow to do things that are universally considered as good. So they can't say that moral metrics exist intrinsically on their side, but not on ours. Those are the moral metrics we will follow. That's why people will know what's good or bad. Their entire response is defeated by their own claims. But next, they said that the last thing about this claim is that it's uncomparative. How did people on their side know what was good or bad? And we told you that what was decided as good or bad on their side of the house was decided by divine authority, where all of these religious leaders have the power to say that God is the one that decides who gets to go into heaven and who gets to go into hell. So not only is it symmetric at best, but in the worst case scenario, the standards of morality on their side of the house are decided by all of these religious leaders. But lastly, the argument they had broadly about poor people. The first thing they said was that poor people will be viewed as sinning in their past life. The second thing they said was poor people can't do charity. They both don't respond to the first responses that we already gave, which is being poor presumably means that you are still a human, which means that you did pretty good in your previous life. But the second response that we already gave was that being kind is incredibly accessible. Small actions can add to your karma balance, but what's the comparative? Small actions don't do a damn thing to change your odds of going to heaven or hell, because absolute categories require proportionately absolute actions, and small things like saying hi to your neighbor are not considered absolute actions and are viewed as insignificant under a model of heaven or hell. But on weighing, we win this claim for many reasons. The first is that we told you, for all of the individuals like LGBTQ individuals, people with criminal records, people who are drug addicts, all of these people will monumentally feel like the stain of their sins are things they will never be able to wash off, no matter how much they worship God, no matter how much good they do in the world. But at least on outside, for all of those people, they can gain points. They can feel as if they do small good actions, they'll be able to climb the ladder and receive a marginally better future outcome. Maybe they'll be born as a fat pigeon instead of being born as a cockroach. So for those people, we will always give them some hope, as opposed to on their side, where they feel like they'll be damned to hell because of some virtue of the fact that they are born into a certain category. This team argues solace in abstract, but for outside of the house, the solace we give to people is that your fate is never fully determined and you can always do things to change it.
Okay, thanks for replying. Thanks everyone for that round. So cross the house and shake hands, and shortly after you can leave so you can talk about